thank you all for joining today. I'm Helen Ferner, and I'm the immediate past president of NZSEE, and I'm delighted to be chairing this session today about the Resilient Buildings Project, and introducing Shannon, who's going to talk to us today. The Resilient Buildings Project was initiated by NZSEE in late 2019 now, so several years ago. It was conceived to lay the groundwork for resilient building design suitable for the 21st century, and it's informed by the perspectives and expectations of building users. And it complements the work that's currently underway updating New Zealand's National Seismic Hazard Model by looking at people's expectations for building performance. And both, of course, will inform any future plans for reviewing the loadings codes. But the Resilient Buildings Project was conceived to stretch the boundaries and reveal options. It's really around the possibility space for future seismic performance. So well beyond code minimum performance requirements. We're not just thinking about that at all. And it's a multi-stage project, and we're in the middle of it at the moment. So the first stage was to set the scene and establish the need and set a vision for the project. The second stage, which Shannon is going to mostly talk about today, is about the research that we've just finished on looking at current societal expectations for seismic performance of buildings. And we're just at the point of starting stage 3, which is to look at the tolerable impacts and to guide development of building performance objectives. And then stage 4 will be to look at how to translate those at a conceptual level into appropriate approaches for design going forward. And we've also got a workshop that's coming up, because we're really thinking about the translation between societal expectations and performance objectives as being a continuum, so that you look at the impacts, the tolerable performance, and then the performance objectives. And we've got a workshop coming up at the annual meeting where we're going to explore that with you in a very active way. It's going to be a very workshop sort of discussion to think about the nuances of all of that. So that should be, we're looking forward to having that, and that's sort of leading into the next stage of the project, and so we really want your input. But right now Shannon is going to tell us about where we've gotten to and what the research has revealed. And so at that point, Shannon, why don't you take it away?
Great, thanks, Helen. So I'll go ahead and share my screen. Great. So as Helen mentioned, the topic of my presentation today is about the findings of the Resilient Buildings Project. So last year, we undertook a big bit of research in order to elicit societal expectations for the seismic performance of buildings. And in this presentation today, I'll be interpreting some of those findings and reflecting really on what affects risk tolerance among individuals in New Zealand. I do want to take a moment to acknowledge the project team, because this was a big team effort. So we have Charlotte Brown, Sophie Horsfall from Resilient Organizations, as well as Helen and Hugh Cohen on the project team. And we also had a steering group whose names are all listed up there. And the idea was to really get together a multi-organizational and multidisciplinary team, so that when we go about eliciting societal expectations and interpreting them, we're getting a wide range of viewpoints, because really this interpretation of societal expectations, from talking to people into something that could be interpreted into code or beyond, is kind of treading in new ground. So Helen gave a really good overview of the Resilient Buildings project, but I'll just wanted to go over a few of the objectives. The first was to document how perceptions of risk and desired building performance vary based on buildings, geography, and community settings, to evaluate the importance of seismic resilience relative to other demands in the built environment, and to develop a clear and shared language of desired building performance objectives. And as I mentioned, the focus of today's presentation is how perceptions of risk change based on different settings. So to go about eliciting societal expectations, we undertook a series of interviews and focus groups. So we did 32 interviews, and we really tried to choose people who would represent lots of different perspectives. So coming at it from different seismic hazard zones, geographies, socioeconomic groups, ownership perspectives, occupancy perspectives, and cultural contexts. And with 32 interviewees, we didn't expect to have a representative sample of the population, but we deliberately chose people who would offer a wide range of options or a wide range of perspectives on their views of seismic risk tolerance. And then within the focus groups, we held 6 geographically based focus groups in 3 urban towns and 3 centers over differing levels of seismic hazard from low to high. And again, we tried to get a good mix of individuals within those focus groups. Once again, we were going for variety of opinion as opposed to having a representative sample. And I don't have time today to get into the actual methods that we used within the interviews and focus groups, but if you are interested, we do have reports available online, and I will put the links into the chat at the end of my talk. So when we think about risk tolerance, what we find is that risk generally falls into 3 major categories: unacceptable, tolerable, and acceptable. Unacceptable risks are generally high impact, frequent events that result in that could result in multi-generational impacts. Whereas acceptable risks on the other side of the spectrum tend to be low impact and rare. And these are the sorts of things that could fall into normal maintenance schedules if we're thinking about earthquakes. However, in the middle, we have this tolerable zone. And this is what we call the trade-off zone within the Resilient Buildings project. And in this zone, tolerance really depends on the cost of the community today and the opportunities for co-benefits. But what's kind of interesting and difficult to capture about this zone is that tolerance varies through space and time. So it's really an individual interpretation of risk, and it can be influenced by a lot of different factors. So when we're talking about earthquake impacts, or the type of earthquake impacts that I'm going to be talking about today when we're discussing risk tolerance, I've just divided into 4 categories, which are life safety, social impacts, economic impacts, and environmental impacts. And I'll go over each of these in the following slides, as well as factors that affect tolerance towards each of these different impacts. And when I start to talk about factors, you'll notice some are similar amongst the different impacts, some are different, and there's some nuances within them. So starting with factors that affect tolerance for life safety. When I say life safety, at this point, I'm really just talking about deaths and injuries either during the earthquake or immediately after. So the first thing that affects tolerance for life safety is seismic hazard, where people in high seismic hazard zones tended to have more risk tolerance. And this higher tolerance in seismic hazard zones just has a lot to do with what people expect to happen. So in low seismic hazard zones, people don't expect there to be earthquakes, so they don't expect there to be deaths or injuries. The density of the built environment also affects risk tolerance, where higher density populations have less risk tolerance, and this is about the concentration of risk. So where there's a lot of people, there's more opportunity or opportunity for there to be mass casualty events, which would be unacceptable. Building type and function affects tolerance for life safety, where people have less tolerance for damage and disruption to buildings that contribute to the ability to save lives, like hospitals or maybe emergency management centers, things that help to save lives following an earthquake. And then also buildings where people may congregate after an event. So that's places like schools people want to have built to a higher level of life safety, because if people tend to go to schools to pick up their children after an earthquake, they don't want there to be any life safety issues in an aftershock. Building occupancy affects life safety, where just as it's written in the code now, people had less tolerance for risk in buildings that had higher occupancy and higher exposure times. And then also people were less tolerant to risk for buildings that contain vulnerable occupants. And when I say vulnerable in this case, what I mean is people who are have less ability to help themselves, like maybe older people with mobility issues or children. Personal experience can also affect tolerance for risk safety, positively or negatively. So in this case, if we take the example of Christchurch, people who experience a Christchurch earthquake will have different views on building types. So they might be weary to go into a multi-story concrete building, but they feel very comfortable in 1 to 2 story timber residential homes. The cost of seismic resilience does play into life safety. So we need to balance financial cost against idealistic safety requirements. Basically, all that means is it's not an empty purse. While life safety is a priority, you're not going to invest tens of millions of dollars to save one single life, typically. And then also competing priorities. In this case, I put climate change, but really what people are weighing up here is the likelihood of a deadly earthquake versus the likelihood of deadly climate change impacts. And in some people, when they're doing their risk tolerance mathematics, they find climate change impacts to be much more likely and therefore more worthwhile investing in. So next, I'll talk about factors that affect risk tolerance for social impacts. And in this case, when I'm talking about social impacts, I'm talking about overall well-being, the dislocation of people following an earthquake, so when they move away, disruption to community assets such as churches, maraes, or other community centers, loss of cultural assets, which could be things like heritage buildings or museums, loss of trust in government, and the capacity to engage in work, study, recreational, and social activities. So basically just the ability to return to normal activities after an earthquake. Again, high seismic hazard zones were more tolerant to social impacts. The density of the built environment affected tolerance for social impacts, and this was really around the dislocation of people. So the higher density environments tend to have more multi-unit, multi-family homes, and people really didn't want to have disruptions to these sorts of multi-family homes because that could lead to temporary displacements and then ultimately more permanent displacements. For building type and function, it did affect risk tolerance, and that was largely place-based. So community priorities or returning to normalcy really depended on where people were. So in cities, some people thought that normal activities were more like going shopping, going to pubs, maybe returning to the office or going to an event at a stadium. Whereas in town, some of the more normal activities had to do with their agribusiness. So it was more around logistics related to warehouses. Building occupancy also affected risk tolerance for social impacts. And in this case, when I'm talking about vulnerable occupants, I'm talking about maybe elderly or physically or mentally disabled people, where these people have a risk of being isolated if there are disruptions to their regular routines. The capacity to recover also affects risk tolerance. So again, this could be positive or negative pertaining to personal circumstances prior to the event. People who are more affluent will likely have more ability to recover after a large earthquake. And then compounding impact or stressors make people less risk tolerant. So if, say, there was a flood or a earthquake in years prior that they're still recovering from, a new earthquake or major event may be more than what people are willing and able to recover from. Again, the cost of seismic resilience comes into play, and really people talked about the need to balance the cost of resilience against the cost of social disruptions. And when they're doing that, they need to be mindful of where costs will fall, because sometimes when trying to manage these social disruptions, costs can fall on communities or individuals that are least able to cope with those costs. And then when we talk about competing priorities, again, it's just about the likelihood of events and the actual ability to whether or not people believe you can mitigate these impacts, because some people were skeptical of the ability to build buildings to mitigate social impacts and thought that investment into other risk mitigation priorities like road safety or healthcare might be a better use of investments. And then finally, changes over time. So what we've seen, especially with COVID in the last 3 years, is that communities' priorities are constantly evolving, and the way we change, or the way we use buildings is always changing. So keeping up with these expectations can be difficult. For factors that affect economic impacts, and for economic impacts, what we discussed was uninsured capital loss and business revenue reduction, though I will say those were some of the less tangible things that we spoke about with the focus groups. So really when people considered economic impacts, what most people thought about were physical assets that support living conditions. So basically protecting their homes and their workplaces, job loss, and then impacts on import and export market. As with the other seismic hazard affected risk tolerance, where people in higher seismic hazard zones were more risk tolerance for a variety of reasons. Again, they expected it and they planned for it, probably better than places with low seismic hazard. Building type and function affected risk tolerance. Again, building type affecting risk tolerance was very much place-based. And in this case, it was important to understand the economic drivers in a community, where places like destination towns would be looking to protect some of their tourism-based building assets. Places with higher proportion of white collar or office workers want to get their workers back in the office sooner, so that those buildings have higher importance. And locations where there are primary production industries are looking to protect the buildings and infrastructure that support logistics around these industries. And for building type and function, the dependence of users on the buildings was also a factor. So many jobs in the service, manufacturing, and primary production industries are dependent upon having a physical place of operation, whereas a lot of office-based jobs can also be done from home. And in terms of retail, there are now a lot more online shopping availability. For building occupancy affecting risk tolerance, we did find that tenants were slightly less tolerant for minor to moderate disruptions, though I will say that was the caveat of our sample size for tenants was small, but it is an interesting finding. And for the capacity to recover affecting risk tolerance, again, we find that the compacting impacts or stressors make people less risk tolerant. So again, that's multiple earthquakes or events in a short period of time. We found that towns were slightly less risk tolerant than cities, and this might have to do with the fact that towns often have fewer economic opportunities. So damage to one of their industries could be devastating for a whole town. And also within the capacity recover are businesses' ability to have, or their plans for continuity. If they have business continuity plans, they tend to be more risk tolerant. And if they're able to distribute their risk geographically throughout the country, they tend to be more risk tolerant. In terms of the cost of seismic resilience, what people mostly talked about in terms of economic impacts was really just the desire to maximize the return on investment into resilience. And kind of going along with that, they do have competing financial priorities, particularly because financial risks are typically only considered in the short term, whereas earthquakes have return periods of hundreds or thousands of years. In terms of factors that affect risk tolerance for environmental impacts, they were quite similar. And then when I do say environmental impacts, I'm talking about waste from damaged buildings, the ability to recycle, hazardous waste, and embodied carbon. Once again, people in higher seismic hazard zones were more tolerant to risk, again, because they expect there to be earthquakes and therefore find that the environmental impacts might be inevitable. Building type and function affected it because people were less tolerant for damage to buildings that contain hazardous materials if that hazardous material had the ability to be uncontained and seep into waterways or soil. Again, the capacity to recovery. So towns were slightly less risk tolerant than cities, and we think this is because of their reliance on agribusiness, so environmental impacts could affect their economic ability to recover. And also the potential, if environmental impacts were viewed as being long-term, they were less tolerable. And for the cost of seismic resilience, what people often talked about was the carbon cost. And in that, the carbon cost can really be viewed as a trade-off. So if you're building buildings that have a higher upfront carbon cost, might be more seismic resilient in the long run, whereas other people didn't want to have such a high upfront carbon cost. And in terms of competing priorities, what people thought about in terms of environmental impacts, again, was just the likelihood of an earthquake causing environmental impacts versus investing to other areas of hazard mitigation where environmental impacts could be mitigated. So now thinking a bit more generally across the impact categories, I just want to highlight again the fact that tolerance for risk is temporal and it can be impacted by current events. So I've listed up there 3 of the main factors that the interviewees and focus group participants considered when discussing their personal or community views on risk tolerance. So starting with COVID, what it really highlighted is that the way we use buildings is changing rapidly and can continue to change rapidly. So some buildings, like office buildings, are less important than they may have been 4 years ago. And the importance of buildings and infrastructure that support essential supply chains has really been heightened over the last few years. Next, when we think about climate change and the associated impacts of climate change, like floods, winds, and storm surges, this was actually the risk that people compared most often with seismic risk. And people often, when they talked about climate change, then kind of reflected back and noted that they've only become aware of it in maybe the last 5 or 10 years. But they were aware that climate change at this point seems inevitable, and it's risks that need to be mitigated, whereas the likelihood of an earthquake, as I said before, could happen within their lifetime or several generations down the line. And then finally, I just wanted to discuss earthquake insurance. So we asked interviewees directly whether access to earthquake insurance would change how they viewed seismic risk, and we got some mixed responses. The thought of losing earthquake insurance really scared some people to the point where they thought it may be too risky to live or work in New Zealand, but others indicated that insurance should really be a last resort, and that if we as a country rely too heavily on it, we've missed opportunities for building resilience in other areas. And this viewpoint was echoed by a representative of the insurance sector who discussed that buildings need to be designed and built with more resilience in order to prevent reinsurers from fleeing the New Zealand market. So now, just switching gears a little bit, I want to talk about how we could manage some of these risks. So just taking a step back, as I've explained, society has expectations for how buildings should perform in order to mitigate the impacts of earthquakes related to life safety, social, economic, and environmental impacts. And within each of these categories, there's some things that are acceptable, some things that are unacceptable, but more often than not, there's a spread of risk tolerance. And risk tolerance is affected by a number of factors, which I've explained throughout the presentation and I've listed here. So how do we go about managing expectations, understanding these factors that affect risk tolerance, and adjusting? So the first and most obvious option that we have is the building code, and that's what we currently use. But the building code, in terms of societal expectations, it reacts to life safety, and you could say it somewhat covers social and economic impacts if you consider amenity and the serviceability limit state requirements. But in terms of the factors that affect risk tolerance, the building code really only covers seismic hazard zone and building type, functionality, and occupancy to an extent with the importance levels. But what we found through our research is that there are all these other factors that affect risk tolerance, and societal expectations for impacts are really broad. So to what point is the building code appropriate for covering all of these different expectations and the overall risk tolerance of people? Not really sure, and that was something our interviewees spoke out about as well. Some thought the building code should be all-encompassing of societal expectations, while others were very happy for the building code to just cover life safety and let the other impacts be driven by market demand. So within the Resilient Buildings project, we kind of brainstormed what other risk management options there might be. And what we discussed was other pieces of legislation that may affect the way that people view risk, more land use planning regulations. So building on better land could lead to better seismic performance, providing education and guidance to both the public and to other structural engineers so that people are able to discuss and manage seismic risk more openly. The government could provide incentives to build more seismically resilient buildings, and some of these risk management options might be market driven. And just to provide a pretty simple visual on how we can start to use risk mitigation options in order to spread risk, I just wanted to introduce this framework for tolerability of risk. And I did pull this from the EQC paper on the proposed risk tolerance framework. But when you look at this upside down triangle, you see up at the top, we have the unacceptable region. In the middle, we have a tolerable region. And at the bottom, we have a broadly acceptable region. What I would say right now is that the building code requirements as they're currently written really only separate the unacceptable from everything else. But if we start to introduce some of these other risk mitigation measures, we could move down, give people the option to move down into more tolerable or broadly acceptable regions. And eventually we can probably start to reach societal expectations as a whole. And expanding on that view of tolerance, we in the Resilient Buildings Project have been looking into how tolerable impacts or tolerable performance have been included in other codes. So this figure that I have up here is from the International Code Council Performance Code for Buildings and Facilities. And it's not a widely implemented code, but it is an interesting framework that they put together. So along the side, they have different levels of earthquakes from small to frequent. And along the top, they have different performance groups. And within the middle, they've defined 4 levels of tolerable damage, where the tolerable damage considers things like structural damage, non-structural damage, as well as the impacts on occupants. And they've matched the magnitude of the event with these different performance groups to form this kind of matrix of risk tolerability. And so this kind of definition of tolerable impacts at different levels is what we'll be looking to do in the next stage of our research, as Helen has mentioned. And when we're considering tolerable impacts, it will be looking back at the social economic impacts, but also we really want to dive into things like functionality, repairability, and sustainability. So as Helen already mentioned, we do have an upcoming workshop at the QuakeCoRE annual meeting where we'll be exploring these sorts of things. So I do encourage anyone who wants to think more critically about it and engage with our activities to attend that. And with that, I'll say thank you for listening. And if I'm happy to answer questions, but do also just want to make a plug for our reports, which are all available online. The full report's been out for a few months now, and we recently published the focus group report and interview report. And I'll put those links in the chat as well. Thank you.